You're listening to a CNA podcast.
Hello everyone, it's Crispina here on this special episode of the Deep Dive podcast. I know we've said that we are on a break, but we're putting this out because there's been an interesting story in the news cycle that has got my WhatsApp messages lit up. Here's a quick summary of how things unfolded. Now, since September 2019, most organizations are not allowed to collect, use, or disclose NRIC details. But last week, a social media post started circulating about how easy it was to get anyone's full IC number via a search function on the ACRA website, Accounting and Corporate Regulatory Authority. Now, to address this issue, the government then announced that there is no reason to protect IC numbers and that this change in the policy was in the works, except that ACRA had gone ahead. Now, this new announcement led to some confusion among many people because all this while, we were conditioned to protect our NRIC numbers. So what's going on? Why the change and how does this impact business and personal data privacy? Joining me are Steve Tann, Deputy Head, Technology, Media and Telecommunications from Rajah and Tann, Singapore. Hi, Steve.
Hey, hi, Crispina. Nice to be here.
And Aaron Ang, Chief Information Security Officer at Singapore-based IT services company Wissen International. Hi, Aaron.
Hi, Crispina. Glad to be here talking about a very important topic.
Okay, gentlemen, thanks for taking the time on such a short notice. Let's get started with a statement by the Ministry of Digital Development and Information, MDDI. It was this bit that caught my attention, and I'm going to read it out for listeners. As a unique identifier, the NRIC number is assumed to be known, just as our real names are known. There should therefore not be any sensitivity in having one's full NRIC number made public, in the same way that we routinely share and reveal our full names to others. I have to admit, I did a double take on that line because the NRIC number in full seems to me quite different from my full name. So what was your reaction firstly? And help us understand, how come suddenly the NRIC number is not sensitive anymore? Maybe Steve, we start with you.
Sure. If you take the popular, perhaps, perception of personal information, and of course, how it operates under general data protection law, regardless of which country we're talking about, there are various types of personal information which are perhaps treated as more sacrosanct than others. So obviously, you've got, say, biometric information, medical information, financial information like bank accounts, and hitherto, your national identification numbers, right?
Yes.
I think it's useful to also hark back to the practice 6, 7, 8 years ago of shopping centers, of office buildings, recept areas. When you seek to gain access as a visitor, they collect your NRIC numbers. Yep. Right? And of course, the regulator then came out to say that that's not permissible. They came out with advisory guidelines. So Singaporeans and organizations in Singapore in general have been conditioned to the fact that the national identification number is rather sacrosanct. And of course, when this surfaced a couple of days ago, it certainly caught many people by surprise, because ultimately, if you take a step back and you sort of start unfolding all the curtains about what is the intention, we still need to wait for the pronouncements.
Yeah.
But based on the recent statements, it's desensitized to the extent that it's still personal data. It still needs to be protected, but it's not that same level of sensitive type personal data that we were conditioned to think it was.
Right, not as secret as before. Aaron, what do you think?
So while Steve has given us the legal perspective of things, from a cybersecurity standpoint, it was actually pretty interesting. So when I first heard the news, the first reaction in all of our minds, at least for the cybersecurity practitioners, is that, oh no, is this where the website has actually given access to a database column that they should not actually have given access to? So was it a cybersecurity incident that caused this to happen? We were all shocked. And in fact, when I first heard the news, we were like, oh no, this must be a loophole, it must be a vulnerability vulnerability that needs to be patched as soon as possible. So surprisingly, it was not. It was actually, after all the announcements and things like that, intended to be so. So my reaction went from being shocked to very shocked, and then to shock and awe in that sense. In the cybersecurity world, we have been so conditioned and trained to think of NRIC numbers as like the holy grail of personal information. Personal information, there's lots of them. Some of them, just one identifier can help you to identify a person, like NRIC. Some of them require a combination of data, and that is essentially what makes up personally identifiable information. But the NRIC has long been seen as protected. You can easily get someone's date of birth, someone's address maybe, but NRIC is something that is really hard to get. So when you actually put out NRICs in the open, like what happened with the ACRA and their licensees website, essentially what you are doing is that now cyber criminals then actually have access to the full suite of data. It actually opens up lots of possibilities that people can actually do. So this change in policy, which was apparently acted on by ACRA much earlier than the rest of the government agencies, actually allows a window of opportunity for cyber criminals to actually harvest the data. Whether or not NRIC remains as something that should be protected, whether NRIC is a unique identifier, whether NRIC is your full name, that honestly does not really matter in the world of cybercrime. Essentially, this data can be used, and it has been used to actually do evil and do harm.
Okay, let me pick up on something you said, Aaron. I know you said that, okay, this is quite shocking, but MTDI has actually said that, look, it's kind of pointless to mask it because the algorithms are so advanced. Basically, the scammers out there have become quite sophisticated. So the idea here is to not protect you anymore and to give you open access to more scammers. I don't think that's the point, right? I think what sits uncomfortably is that all this while, PDPA says don't collect full IC number, right? And now they're saying, okay, full IC number is not as vulnerable as we thought it was, or we initially made it out to be. So is it at odds? Is there some kind of like a mismatch between the PDPA requirements? Steve, what do you think?
I mean, we can't obfuscate the fact that through the years, we've been really conditioned to the fact that, yes, we've got to treat national identification numbers carefully because it's immutable, and it in itself is like your master key, right, to unlocking lots of access to other platforms, data and stuff like that. And of course, now that you see a change coming from the pronouncement from MDDI, 13 December, their media release. Then PDPC, of course, came out with their release on 14 December, right? And the jury's not out yet, right? Because if you read that release carefully, they're focusing on authentication, on password access. Those are more from a hygiene perspective of how do you authenticate yourself, what sort of passwords you should be using. You should be using these anyway. And prior to, in years past, they've always been advocating that. So no change at that. But when you look at perhaps the end parts and all that, there's no inconsistency between what PDPC is saying vis-a-vis MTDI. They're just saying that they're looking at this more carefully and they come up with a fuller perspective on things, as well as amending the advisory guidelines once they seek public consultation and stuff like that.
But in my mind, maybe this is quite simplistic, but isn't the IC number a critical piece of information in terms of all our personal information? Like, government services, banking, healthcare, etc., etc. Does that change anything? In other words, will my data still be protected?
Good question, and that was the part about cybersecurity that sort of led on from what Aaron mentioned a while ago. The answer to what you asked is yes and no, right? Does it change anything? Yes, because all along we've treated the national identification number as being a secret piece of personal data. Not many people have access to that. So that in itself can be used by various organizations to unlock perhaps the doorway to other platforms, other access to other types of data. When you're dealing with platforms which have more significant repercussions for the individual in question, such as internet banking, you need a 2FA, right? Or multi-factor authentication as well.
Sure.
So that's the yes part. The no part then would be what MDDI and potentially PDPC are now going to move towards is that let's treat now the NRIC number as like the name. Then it means that organizations such as banks and all that, when it comes to trying to authenticate you as perhaps the actual person who's trying to gain access to your own banking account and stuff like that, I can no longer just simply ask you for NRIC and all that. I need to ask you lots of other peripheral questions. Your date of birth, how many bank accounts you have.
What's your pet's name?
Yeah, things like that, right?
So in other words, the IC is no longer enough. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, correct. And actually, in the past, the IC was never enough. They usually ask more questions for the more sensitive type platforms like banks, right?
Yeah.
But of course, for other less intrusive, less sensitive type platforms, they may just ask you for the NRIC and that's that, right? Let's not kid also around with the fact that even prior to this, if you do a Bizfile, maybe on an individual or even for certain corporations, you can actually find the NRIC numbers online. But not to the extent that happened recently, right?
Yes,
in that sense.
Like
So
all the full details.
Yeah, that already, prior to that, was already something that disturbed me a little bit, right?
Yeah.
For example, when I deal with data breaches and we're dealing with investigations by the regulator, then and if NRIC is in play, I need to think about that from, strategically, how do we then submit it? Because that we can gain access to some NRICs anyway, right? That sort of thing.
Yeah. Technically, a scammer could use my full name, my full IC number, which is easily accessible now, and I don't know, get an illegal loan or something. So this is the cybersecurity part, right, Aaron?
A couple of matters in play here. So the first important thing to note is that in the past, I think as Steve mentioned, you can actually purchase this profile for $33 that actually gives you information about a company or an individual. But what essentially we are moving away from that, from one information that you actually need to pay to get, to having a trove of information that essentially is now becoming, for lack of a better term, public information. So it is no longer something that sits behind a gateway where you have to pay for it. I mean, if I'm a cyber criminal and I'm going to pay for 1 million IC numbers, obviously something is going to trigger someone. But right now, this information essentially is available. I don't actually need to pay. And if you look at the dark web in the terms of the cybersecurity forums, personal information of countries like Singapore are actually very valuable. People are actually willing to pay for such information to do whatever they want. So back to your question, Crispina, on a policy standpoint, it is quite evident that the general direction of our government is trying to shift from masking the NRIC numbers. In fact, I would say it is quite true to say that if you actually have the year of birth, and the last 2 to 3 digits, you can actually make a very educated guess at the full NRIC number of a person. But there is a very fundamental difference between security and privacy. So security, for ease of understanding, for example, we all use Google. We trust that Google has in place security measures to make our data safe. But that doesn't mean that Google is not collecting information about me, that I agreed to. So the question then is, am I comfortable to have Google collect all of this data about me? Just give you an example. If I use Google Maps for navigation, all of this data is sent back to the servers in Google. Am I then comfortable to actually have this data with Google? Now, obviously, if I need to use the service, if I need to have it for GPS, then yes, I am comfortable. But right now, the question is, as individuals, are we all at that comfort level to know that, okay, our NRIC numbers are actually out there? And that is the reason why I think the initial reaction from the public was, whoa, okay, everyone was kind of like, what's going on? Because we have all been so used to that level of protection. And as Steve has mentioned, organizations have been using it as a form of verification or authentication. I mean, just take it at the simplest level. Before you get wheeled into a surgery, the doctor asks you, what is your NRIC number? You know, and that kind of just becomes the only authentication that they are used. I mean, they can't be asking you to whip out your phone, scan your SingPass before you go to an operating theater. It just doesn't work that way.
Fingerprint scan.
Yeah, I mean, eventually it might have to.
Okay, initially I was wondering, what is this false sense of security that they were talking about? So I have a little bit of clarity now. It appears as if we only relied on the NRIC, right, to get anything done, whether it's authenticating who we are or getting access to data, etc. You might think, okay lah, once I give my IC, everything's fine. But now basically the shift is not so straightforward. You guys need to come up with an entire new system where your security and your data security and your privacy, etc., are taken care of. Steve?
regardless of what these recent developments have made, the requirement to protect personal data, all sorts of personal data, has always been there, right? From an organizational perspective, for organizations, because for them, most of the time, they've been conditioned such that if we collect national identification numbers, we better put strong protection measures.
Yeah.
Now that it's been desensitized, right, we can say, okay, I'll just view it like a name. I'll just put it in whatever, we protect it, give it reasonable protection measures, and that's it, voila, then I don't really have to bother about that. And of course, if there's a cyber attacker that comes in, I can make arguments about the fact that, hey, this is not biometric data, this is just like your name, email address, and all that, right, that sort of thing. Even the regulator themselves, when they are going to investigate, they will have to then also deal with the fact that folks like myself, the legal practitioners, the cybersecurity specialists and all that, they may be making arguments such as this. I mean, this is a pronouncement from government, right? It's supposed to be an identifier such as a name. So please don't punish me and don't treat it in the same way as biometric data.
Yeah, that's going to take some getting used to. Okay, so now businesses are saying, hey, all this while we've invested money to make sure that all our requirements fit the PDPA. So given this change, do you think it will be business as usual or SOPs will definitely need to change?
In the past, because of, for example, the advisory guidelines from PDPC that deals with national identification numbers, where it prohibits collection of NRIC numbers. So obviously, organizations such as those that man the security counters at commercial buildings or at shopping malls, in the past they would simply collect your NRIC number, but they then had to maybe come up with a new automated system such that it didn't. So right now, because of that, I mean, obviously some of them would say, oh God, we didn't have to waste that much money or spend that much money on that, right? But I would say that it's a journey. The law does change every now and then, and I think perhaps there is a good policy reason as to why the government wants to now shift the NRIC into a common unique identifier along with the name. Right. And we got to wait what they say. But for businesses, don't jump on that bandwagon yet. I think they need to wait for PDPC to come up with its full consultation and stuff like that, and then what is the final decision on that. But if it follows the line of what MDDI has said, and that is going to be as common as a name, then it just means that moving forward, perhaps there are more potential users by which they can simply collect, right? Like lucky draws in the past, which for the umpteenth years they've stopped doing that, and other instances where they don't really have to scratch their head to think, okay, if I'm not collecting NRIC numbers, what else should I be collecting? That sort of thing.
But nowadays, they collect your email address, they collect your handphone number, they collect other things, right? Because they were working around this.
There's also an underlying theme or principle in data protection law, which you could say is enshrined in a purpose limitation obligation, which is one of the 10 data protection obligations. And that really requires organizations to collect and use only what types of personal information is necessary. So if, for example, you know that even if the NRIC number is to be viewed as desensitized as a name, but then you have to ask yourself, as an organization, if I'm collecting types of personal information, do I actually need the national identification number? If I do not need, then you shouldn't be, because if you do collect still, even though it's now desensitized, you could still be guilty of that principle, which requires you to only collect types of personal information which are absolutely relevant and necessary for the purposes at hand.
Aaron, what do you think businesses will have to do now?
So in 2018, when PDPC came up with their guidelines, right, I know of companies who scrambled. If you actually have NRIC in your customer records, for example, they scrambled to actually add on layers of encryption, protection on those data, so that they have done their due diligence to secure the data, so that in case of a data breach, they can actually say that, hey, I've done my due diligence, I wasn't slipshod in all of these things. So they actually invested a lot of money, and some of these systems are really not cheap. So the interesting thing then is, companies have already developed such automated systems to be able to issue documents, financial institutions giving you statements that are protected, and things like that. And all of this is on the basis that the NRIC number is a sensitive information that only probably you have. But moving forward, they will actually have to invest in technology. Then how am I going to secure all of these documents that are going to be circulated via email? Am I not going to send it via statements anymore? Do you actually have to log on to an app with other forms of authentication before you can retrieve these statements is definitely one way to do it. But that's going to change the way companies operate, and that's going to actually change the way people access their information as well. So there's a transition period. It involves cost, it involves time, and more importantly, it involves training as well, because you actually need to train your staff to actually get all of this up to speed and up to standard. It's not going to happen in a matter of months. In fact, I would say it will take a minimally fastest, probably about 1 year, to get all of this sorted out, and that's only after PDPC has issued their guidelines, of course. In fact, this morning I saw someone posted on LinkedIn, now that the SOPs are going to change, now that laws are going to change, if you need help in this, come to me. People are already doing that. So yeah,
good business opportunity for cybersecurity folks, right? Okay, last question, guys. What's a sensible approach in a super digital world? I need to verify identity to access services, but at the same time also protect my privacy, right? And not to be like an open door to potential scammers. Is there even a sensible approach, you think?
Let's take a step back and look at some of the things rather than just NRIC numbers alone. Let's talk about at the checkpoints, for example. We don't actually need our passports to be able to actually travel overseas. At Changi Airport, you just need to scan your face and you can get access. At the land checkpoints, you just need to use a QR code and you can get past the systems. So you do realize that there is a shift towards other forms of authentication. It might not necessarily be a hard copy authentication. It can be something that is you, for example, your biometrics. Moving forward, at least from the government or a smart nation standpoint, and that might be the reason why there is a change in the legislations or even the government's perspective on NRIC numbers. So if we are moving forward in that direction in terms of the Smart Nation initiative, I can see and I can understand why the government might be moving towards such a direction. So let's talk about businesses, for example. If I go to a massage parlor, for example, I have an account there. What kind of information am I comfortable to give? Honestly, at this point, even with our NRIC's numbers being protected, with PDPC giving us guidelines, I am not comfortable giving businesses any form of my personal data if possible. A lot of times when they ask for even my address and my date of birth, I don't actually put my real address or my date of birth on some of this information.
Yeah, but if you buy something and you want to sign up as a member, that's a basic requirement, right?
I would ask myself, do they need this information? For example, if I'm buying a membership at a nail salon, for example, do they really need my address? What do they need it for? So it is really a matter of public education as well. So I guess amongst everything, the first question we as consumers need to ask is, do they really need this piece of information? Now, if a business, because of the desensitization of NRIC numbers, is asking me for my NRIC number, clearly I'm going to ask, why do you need this information? You could use a customer number if you really have to. You could use my picture, but then again, with the developments now, whether I'm comfortable giving you my picture is another thing.
Okay.
So I guess there's a lot of things to think about. Yeah.
Steve, what do you think in a super digital world? How to verify and then protect?
Data is just a piece of the puzzle, and data is a huge piece of the puzzle. It's ever evolving. I'm actually very interested to see the policy rationale behind why we are desensitizing national identification numbers. Because if you think about it, across different countries, right, once you have certain types of personal information, it makes identity theft that much easier. And we know that a person's email address can be actually easily obtained, a person's name can be easily obtained, and sometimes certain passwords can as well, right, from prior data breaches, because most people, they just use the same password for everything, right?
That's right.
And so once you have the additional identification number, then it's easier to do that, which means that for businesses, they now have to grapple with the fact that if I really want to authenticate a person properly and ensure that whoever is signing up for my service is indeed that person, I can not only now just rely on that. I may have to just cite the actual identification card itself, that sort of thing, have it uploaded, and as well as have other types of personal information, right, added into the fray. Ultimately, when it comes to where are we going in terms of the digital age, what sort of security that should be, I think it's ever evolving. The bottom line is that, yes, identification number is actually a very important piece of personal information. It's being desensitized based on present statements. We want to know why. There could be a very good reason, right? Aaron mentioned about Smart Nation and all that. Some of us may take a step back and think, okay, to be a Smart Nation, do we really need the opening up of the national identification number? I don't know, right? Because thus far we've been doing very well.
Okay, guys, we have to wrap it up. So maybe one top tip when it comes to protecting your privacy, protecting your data? Aaron, you go first.
Always ask yourself, when you ask for a certain piece of data, government agencies aside, even with government agencies as well, do they really need this piece of data when you are filling out a form, when you're online? Just always ask yourself, what is this information going to be used for? Am I comfortable giving this piece of data out to whoever? And always assume, no matter which organization, which company, that their measures are insufficient, because essentially that is always the case. You never trust someone too much. In cybersecurity, there's a concept of zero trust. Always question, always doubt, never trust. That would be my advice.
So I'll look at it from both consumer and organizations. For consumers, really, it's intended with what Aaron is saying. If someone is asking for something and you're uncomfortable with that, for example, like in the past, before even the NRIC guidelines or whatever, I never joined Lucky Draw simply because they always ask for NRIC numbers. And to me, I feel that, I give up my life just to win a TV. No, I'm not going to do that, right? So that's a top tip for you. For organizations, this so-called desensitization doesn't really change the fact that NRIC still is part of that body of personal data that you're supposed to protect. It may change in a sense of the level of security required may then be sort of devalued slightly to other types of personal data, as opposed to the same level of sensitive personal data like biometric data or medical information.
Right.
But for organizations, you've got to watch this space, right?
Yep.
Because the regulators are going to look at that.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thanks for listening to this episode. And as always, we welcome your views. Do write to us at cnapodcast@mediacorp.com.sg. My thanks to the team as well, Junaidi Johari, Tiffany Ang, Saya Win, and Joanne Chan. There are no clear answers at this point, but stay tuned.